His name is synonymous with one of the biggest media brands on the planet. David Zaslav has been at the helm of Discovery for over a decade and has transformed the cable network into one of the fastest-growing industry juggernauts. He's dedicated to building a brand that powers people's passions, expanding the company's international content portfolio into live sports and DIY, and is teaming up with big-name celebrities like Tiger Woods and Chip and Joanna Gaines. Jon Steinberg, the president of news at Altice USA, that's our parent company, caught up with David at Discovery's headquarters here in New York.
David, thank you for joining us on Israel Business Weekly.
Good to see you. One of my favorite countries.
And Discovery is available in Israel. You're on Hot and Yes, right?
Yeah, we have 9 channels there, yes. Yeah.
All right, well, so for this audience, they're probably more interested in you as a person than all the people that know the company. But just set the scene for someone who might not know who you are and what the company you run is.
Okay, sure. Well, my family is from Eastern Europe.
Uh-huh.
My grandmother, which is a longer story, which I'll tell you, is from Warsaw. And the rest of my family is from the Ukraine, from Odessa. And I'm a typical Jewish kid that grew up with Eastern European grandparents that immigrated to this country, came with nothing. I think probably the most interesting story is the story of my grandma Ina, who got out of Warsaw, but when things were already starting to get pretty bad. They had a fair amount of wealth, and they owned a brownstone. And her cousin was who was her best friend was a doctor as a young woman, which was unusual because the Jews were really prospering. There were 3 million Jews in Poland at the time.
My family's from Poland too. Okay, yeah.
And they started to lose. My grandmother would tell me the stories of. Little by little, all the things that they lost. And the terrible moment where her grandmother and her got out of the country was they had lost they lost their building, they lost their belongings, and my grandmother was on the street with a toothbrush cleaning the street and was kicked. And they said, we have to get out of here. But because they had acquired some wealth at that time within Poland, one of the things that you do if you had reached a certain level of success was that you got you got an original painting made of you. So my great-grandparents had these paintings of them in Poland at that time. And when my grandmother and her mother got out of Poland, they got out with nothing, but they rolled up those paintings, and when they left the country, they took them with them. And if you go to my mom's house today, those 2 paintings of her great-grandparents are on the wall.
An amazing story of survival.
Yeah. And it was, growing up, it was you live with this idea of never again. I lived with it from all 4 of my grandparents and what they had and what was taken away from them. And the idea that not nobody, but not enough people stood up for the Jews at that time, and that the idea was, the value was, we have to stand up for all people, all ethnicities, and never again, which was really a mantra for my generation, instilled in us by my grandparents, was this idea that we have to stand up for everyone. And it's one of the reasons why I joined the Shoah Foundation.
Yes.
Which is principled on standing up for any group, whether it's ethnicity or skin color, that is oppressed because of who they are. And it's I look at how lucky I've been in my life, and the real luck comes from the people that I've gotten a chance to be around. And one of them is Elie Wiesel, and I was attracted to him really because, as a group in America, this idea of never again, we never really lived up to it. And Elie Wiesel did. And he really stood for that pure ideal that we, as Jews, given the heritage that we have, need to stand up for everyone. Because the principle of what happened to us is partly because those around us didn't stand up for us, and Elie did that.
When you launched this this new documentary with Steven Spielberg that you're debuting on Discovery called Why We Hate, you know, in your quote about the launch of it, you said now is more important than ever in some ways to release a series like this. What did you mean by that?
Well, I think the world has changed, and you know, we tend to think when we're here in America that it's just about America, because the level of hate has gone up, whether it's the view of Muslims or of Jews or of African Americans, Hispanics, immigrants. There tends to be, and I think part of it has to do with the fact that the conditions today are very similar to what the conditions were in the 20s and early 30s. The GDP growth across Europe and Latin America has been relatively flat for 10 or 15 years and pretty low here in the U.S. There's been wage deflation or very little wage growth. And in the 20s, there was an industrial revolution that left a lot of people lost in terms of what profession do I have now, because of the Industrial Revolution took away a lot of the professions. Here we have a technological revolution that has really changed a lot of people's lives, and what resulted in the 20s and 30s was a sense of hopelessness. And what's resulted in U.S. and around the world is a sense of hopelessness. And one of the things that Stephen and I talked about 5 years ago was, where does hate come from? And we looked back at the 20s. And this was really Stephen's idea of really trying to understand where hate comes from as a legacy issue. And I had a great passion for that. But over the last 5 years, we've seen the technological revolution kind of steamroll a lot of occupations, put a lot of people out of work. And we've seen recession or challenges all over the world. And as a result of that, and it's when you see it, it's one of the things you'll see in the documentary, is when you're struggling, as human beings, we are hopeful. And we're hopeful for 3 years, we're hopeful for 5 years.
Yes.
But if you're a mom and you and your husband haven't gotten a raise in 10 or 15 years, and your kids are unemployed and things are not going well, you lose hope. And when you lose hope, there's a very strong link between hope and hate. And so all of a sudden, you're looking through the restaurant and someone else is eating dinner in there, and you're thinking, you know, why is my life the way it is? And so philosophically, I think the best thing that we can have to address this issue of hate and hopelessness is to get some economic growth, to figure out how to get people employed. There is a link between those two.
When you speak and you talk about shared success and what other people need, it sounds a lot like speeches I've heard from John F. Kennedy and Robert Kennedy, and you recently, you know, were given the RFK award. And, you know, I began this thing asking you about your Jewish faith and your family background, but it strikes me that the Kennedys were unbelievably influential on your worldview. Am I right in that?
Well, I was 8 years old when Robert F. Kennedy was assassinated.
Yep.
But there was a picture of John F. Kennedy and Robert F. Kennedy in my home.
Yep.
And for my dad, he went to a number of the rallies, and he really believed in the values of RFK. And the first time I got up one morning and saw my father at the kitchen table crying. It was the first time I ever saw my father cry.
Yep.
And he said to me that something terrible happened last night, that Robert Kennedy was killed. And he said that Robert Kennedy's values, his values, are our values.
Okay.
And it was a moment for me, you know, and I do think life is about values. And if you look at the values that Robert F. Kennedy had, they are values that they're strongly held Jewish values. They're also strongly held Catholic values, Protestant values. They're the values of respecting other people and fighting for the rights of all. They're the same values that my grandparents had when they said to me, "Never again." They're the same values that the young Jews that lost their lives had in the 60s when they went down south and they walked across the bridge in Selma.
Yep.
It was those values of it's not all about yourself, it's about fighting for others. And those are values that we all strive for, and we come up short. But they're values that we need today more than ever. And it's a difficult time in America, and it's a difficult time around the world. So I think that we need them even more.
David, the last topic I want to touch on is Israel from a business standpoint and Israel from a, I guess, a social and political standpoint. But let's start with business. You know, I mean, Israel is obviously an unbelievably small market, but it's become a burgeoning technology and media market. You know, whether you talk about, you know, our parent company has Hot, or you talk about Keshet over there, which is producing incredible content. A small market for you, but what do you think of the Israel market for Discovery?
It's a great market, particularly because it's a great technology market. When you go to Israel, it's there's just a tremendous amount of energy and technology and IP. So it's a place to go to see where things are going and what's happening. It's also a very good traditional market in terms of advertising and television consumption. I love Israel.
Yeah.
You know, Tel Aviv is fantastic. I remember one Christmas with my whole family walking into the King David.
Yes.
And it felt like I was walking into the Regency on Park Avenue. I walked into the King David, and I saw, first person I saw was Barry Diller checking in.
Yep.
I ran into a group of 4 or 5 friends of mine that I didn't know were in Israel. And I remember sitting on that veranda and thinking about that scene from Exodus, which
Yeah.
I grew up watching, and I still watch once a year during the period of the High Holy Days, and remembering what happened to the King David, and thinking about how lucky we are to have Israel and what it took, and the strength of the Haganah and the Irgun and the heart of the Israeli people to fight for a free democracy. And you know what that means, and what that means to all of us as Jews, that Israel continue to prosper for my children, for my grandchildren, but also as kind of a shining light of democracy. And it's highly imperfect.
Yeah.
And there's a lot you could say about Israel. There's a lot you could say about our democracy here in the U.S. But they're continuing to strive toward the best democracy, and it's a great country.